everyone. I have a lot to cover, so I'm going to talk quickly because I got 12 minutes. So actually the speakers thus far have already made my life easier. He's already made the point that we live in a world of alternative facts, and I begin with this quote from the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, which is that I think one of the challenges I think of science communication for me as a communicator in psychology. I think psychology is particularly challenging because everyone's a psychologist, which is kind of good. So it's kind of a double-edged sword because everyone loves psychology and it's fascinating. The problem is a lot of psychology seems intuitive, even when it may not be correct. So I think that's one of the big challenges in communicating a lot of things in the social sciences is people often trust their opinions rather than the data. And of course we live in a world of post-truth and alternative facts and all that kind of stuff. Post-truth was the word of the year last year, and it's a real challenge in many domains. It's actually not in psychology, but some of you may have seen some things like this. This clicker's working, but you can see. This is top 20 election stories last year that were on Facebook, and what you saw is that by the time of election day, the number of stories that were fake or questionable actually began to exceed the number of real stories. So we got a battle here. I think it's a real struggle. I think it's actually harder than people realize. This is I don't actually agree with everything on this graph. It's some real clear science, but just makes the point. It's kind of a two-dimensional graph. Makes the point there's enormous variation. I think probably this goes without saying, enormous variation in terms of the quality of news coverage. The two-dimensional graph, whether on the x-axis is the evidence readable, compelling. On the y-axis is I'm getting it backwards. X-axis is driven mostly by evidence, the y-axis is it readable, and the key point is there's an enormous amount of variation here, all the way from things like Nature, Science, New Science, all the way from the food babe and InfoWars. And again, I think we take for granted here, not in this audience, but we take for granted the fact that we can usually make that distinction. We have to remember for the general public, usually if it's on a computer, it's real. And again, I think that's the biggest problem we're faced with. So internet literacy, I think, is something that we as educators kind of failed on. I think a lot of people think, oh, it's on the internet, therefore it's real. But so we can laugh at that quote, but again, a lot of people can't tell the difference. It's not because they're stupid, but because they've not been educated in that way. And of course, it's not hard to find all kinds of funny examples like this that we can kind of laugh at from the media. Again, these are kind of the easy ones, though, so these are kind of funny, but the harder ones, I think, are the ones that Stephen Colbert talks about as truthy. Those are the ones I want to focus on here. The ones that kind of seem to be true, that kind of feel right, they feel well, their intuition, fit with their intuitions, and so on. And again, I think truthy claims are the main ones that we have to confront. One of the things I've written about, I do a lot of popular writing on this, I teach a course, and this is how to debunk false claims. And actually, I have to say, I don't think I did very well for many years. I'm not sure I'm doing it all that well. I think I'm getting a little bit better, but I don't think we've done a very good job of it for a couple of reasons. So that there are a couple of truthy claims here, and here are a couple of cases where I think the media has done an especially bad job in general. Again, there are exceptions. One is a headline like this. I like dark chocolate, I hope the guards get a stroke, but I have no idea. And I think one example is in medical claims like this, the media, as I often tell my students, goes on at length, but often doesn't tell you the single most important thing you need to know about that study was, did it use actually random assignment? Was it an experiment or was it a big epidemiological study? That's the single most important thing you need to know to evaluate that study. Often the media doesn't tell you that. Another example, closer on from psychology, where the media's done a bad job, I think, is in the coverage of psychological claims, particularly those relevant to psychological treatments. How many people, out of curiosity, have heard of facilitated communication? Some of you have. So I have my own views on this, but in my view, it's one of the great mental health tragedies, I think, of the late 20th, now early 21st century. The claim was that individuals with autism, spectrum disorder, it's not called, who were mute and were assumed to be the old term mentally retarded, but now intellectually disabled. Oftentimes, like IQs of 30 and 40, the claim is with the aid of the facilitator, shown there on the left, the individual can suddenly type out sentences, words, paragraphs, entire books, and so on. And oftentimes, kids with estimated IQs of 25 or 30 were now re-estimated about IQs of 140, 150, and so on. And make a long story short, the data convincingly show that facilitative communication does not work. The procedure is very much like a Ouija board effect. Facilitators, without even realizing it, are actually controlling the communication. Why do I make this point? The reason I make this point is that one common error the media so often makes is what physicist Bob Park has termed pseudo-symmetry, and I think you see that in a lot of media coverage, facilitated communication being one egregious example, where the media, in a well-intentioned effort, I think, to play it fair, covers things kind of equally. So we'll provide so-called experts on both sides, and the problem there is that often, and I've been a victim of this too, where I'm kind of a token. So I've been interviewed like an ESP, for example, extensive perception, where I think the evidence is about 99.9999% to 0.001 in terms of the research evidence. The research evidence for it's essentially non-existent in terms of replicable evidence. But again, the media will present it like, oh, well, you know, some people think this, and then there's this token skeptic like me who says no, and people read it and they go, well, I guess it's kind of mixed. Scientists always disagree with each other, so it's kind of about a stalemate. And that's, again, I think is one of the big challenges we have as science communicators. In my own field, and also in medicine, there's a big push toward evidence-based science, evidence-based practice, and I think that's wonderful, but the question is, does evidence-based science really change people's hearts and more importantly, their minds? And I don't know the answer to that, but I will say this, that we have a real uphill battle, and these are some numbers from a Chapman University poll a couple of years ago, just to show you what kind of uphill battle we have in terms of educating the public. 41% of Americans think that places can be haunted, 20% believe that aliens have visited Earth, about 13-14% believe in astrologers, and so on. 26.5% believe that living dead can communicate. By the way, as an aside, communicating with the dead is actually not all that difficult. It's getting the dead to talk back, that's the hard part. But again, the key part is that some of these beliefs may turn out to be correct, perhaps. But the problem is the research evidence for these beliefs at this point is very weak. So again, that's one of the challenges. I think, in very broad brush, I would argue the principal model of science communication that I think we tend to use, and I think I was taught to use, is what has been termed the deficit model. The deficit model presumes that the general public has a deficit in knowledge, and all we got to do is fill that deficit. That's what I assumed too. Isn't that nice? So all we got to do is just teach people stuff and they will absorb it. I've learned the hard way that often doesn't happen. And one problem is, maybe we're not very good at it, the other problem is the public often doesn't hear what we're saying. So one problem is, as previous speakers have pointed out, scientists are often not trained to be good communicators. We often don't communicate very clearly or well, so there's a problem with implementation for sure. But I think there's a deeper conceptual problem with the deficit model. And by the way, I put this up, I'm a big fan of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's one of my personal heroes. I would like to believe he's right about science literacy. I'm a big believer in science literacy, but I'm not sure it's the full solution. I think it's a partial solution, but I'm not sure it's a panacea. And I think that's sort of the deficit model. People don't know the science, we just got to tell them the science, it works. Well, some recent data from Dan Kahan and others, that's Kahan at Yale, call some of these deficit model claims into question. There's some other data I won't present here. Some of you may be familiar with this work. I can summarize this graph real simply. What you find is if you look, I'm going to simplify things here just a little bit, and one other point to remember, you're communicating with the public is sometimes it's okay to simplify, but you let people know you're simplifying. So that's what I'm going to do here. Simplify key things here a little bit. By and large, what Kahan finds is if you look at liberals and conservatives and look at their attitudes toward global warming or the beliefs about global warming, is global warming happening? Is it a threat to the public? What you find is that among liberals, not shown here, among liberals, the more they know about the science of global warming, the more they believe that global warming is happening, the more they believe it's a threat, which you might expect. Among conservatives, and this is what's shown here, you find an interesting pattern. What you find is that, it's actually a replicated finding now, among conservatives, the more they know about the science of global warming, the more scientific literate they are, the more skeptical they are that global warming is occurring. That is, the more doubtful they are about it. So you're actually seeing a boomerang effect in the other direction. And it's not it's a correlational finding, as we'd say, it's not necessarily causal, but it raises the possibility that merely giving people information is not going to help. I think part of the problem is that people will hear what they want to hear, and oftentimes scientific literate conservatives are they're following the news too. They're reading, was watching Fox News, they're reading websites, but they're either doing it selectively or they're interpreting the information, much of which is ambiguous, in accord with their biases, in accord with their preconceptions. I'll try to end in a couple of minutes here. This is a nice graph, now a little bit outdated, but I think it's still a pretty helpful, nice figure from Stephen Lewandowski and his colleagues that you can get on the web. It's actually called the Debunking Handbook. A couple of minor modifications I'd make about this, but this is a key figure to understand, I think, if you want to dispel myths, dispel misconceptions in the general public. The key point here, and this now is very well replicated in the public health area, is that you will sometimes get backfire or boomerang effects when you communicate to the general public. That is, if you tell people, oh, there's no good evidence that vaccines cause autism, what you see, and Norbert Schwartz has shown this, what you see is that about 10 minutes later they'll say, oh yeah, that's right, vaccines don't cause autism. And it does seem to change their minds in the short run. You come back a week or two later, and in some studies they're actually more likely to believe that vaccines cause autism. So that little, they call it a negation tag, that little yellow sticky tag that would be on our head like, no, this is wrong. This is wrong. Vaccines don't cause autism. That often falls off. And they say, oh yeah, I heard this story about vaccines and autism. Oh yeah. So I guess vaccines cause autism, right? And that's what you often see. So here are a couple of problems to confront as you're educating the public about misconceptions. The continued influence effect is the fact that oftentimes, even when evidence is debunked, people continue to believe it. The good news is I'll have some partial solutions to this in the last minute or two of my talk. Familiarity backfire effect is the well-documented effect that the more you keep repeating the myth again and again and again, oftentimes people will confuse the myth with the reality. Again, vaccines don't cause autism, vaccines don't, blah, blah, blah. Oh, vaccines, oh yeah, I heard in my class that vaccines, something vaccines don't, I guess that must cause autism. So again, if you do that, particularly when you don't provide a competing causal narrative, that will often happen. Overkill backfire effect is a similar thing, I won't go into that. The other key point, the last one, is the worldview backfire effect. The data seem to suggest that when you're threatening people's deeply held worldviews, not surprisingly, you're more likely to get backfire effect. So for example, if you're trying to educate fundamentalist Christians about natural selection, that's where you're going to most likely get these kinds of effects. I think we so often forget about the fact that some of these scientific beliefs are not merely these unemotional things, that they're things that in many cases strike to the very heart of people's beliefs. So what are the recommendations here? I had one or two extra slides, but actually I'm going to skip them because Carol did a good job of making the point about stories. I think there are a couple of recommendations that I would offer in educating the public, particularly when you're trying to disabuse them of myths and misconceptions. And these are, I think, to some extent, evidence-based recommendations. Number one, you really want to provide, and the data suggests this, you want to not merely debunk the belief. Sometimes you do have to debunk the beliefs and know this is wrong. You do have to start with that, but rarely is it enough. You have to supply people with a competing causal narrative, a story that is just as interesting, ideally more interesting, that can displace that story in people's minds. That's really, really crucial. Another evidence-based point to remember is that you want to emphasize the fact, if you can, we won't get a debate about philosophically whether they're facts or not, but the things that are well supported, you want to emphasize that much more than the myth. Say the myth once or twice, boom, then move on. Then you want to actually tell people what there's good evidence for. If you keep repeating the myth again and again and again, you may end up with this familiarity backfire effect. By the way, one little footnote here, a recent study I found suggests that it's particularly common among the elderly, and they may be prone to these kinds of memory errors. So if you're dealing with elderly populations, that myth, that may be particularly problematic. And the last thing I'll say here, I'll end with this slide, is in terms of the worldview backfire effect, this seems like a really obvious point, and I apologize having to make it, but I make it partly because I don't think I did a very good job of it early in my career too, is people don't like to be made to feel stupid. I know that's nothing new, but I think as scientists we sometimes forget that. So it's really important particularly if you communicate, it's always important, but it's particularly important if you're communicating to the general public about something that really is likely to get people's hackles up, or people have strong emotional investments. It's really, really crucial to impart respect, to do that in a way where you do not make people feel stupid, you do not make people feel insulting, and also when you don't make people feel that they're trapped, that they have no place to go. So if they're a religious person, you don't want to make them feel like, oh, sorry, if you're religious, you can't believe in evolution, and I think that's often the message that some people I respect and like Richard Dawkins, but I fear that's the message they often give. And not surprising, that's oftentimes you get backfire effects. People go, okay, so I'm religious, I guess there's no place for me to go, therefore, sorry. It's between you and the Bible, I'm going to stick with my Bible, that's what I learned. So again, respect is particularly important. So I will end there, thanks.